Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. On the 18th of June 1815, three fires broke out in central Belgium that would go down in the annals of military history. The first, and perhaps least well known, would actually prove to be pivotal in the scale of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, delaying the arrival of Bulow's 4th Prussian Corps to the point that it would take them 12 hours to march from Wavre to Plancenoit on Napoleon's right flank, arriving at a time when the emperor was hopelessly overcommitted to the fight against Wellington's Anglo-Dutch troops. The second is often sidelined as a passing comment in the story of the defence of Haye Sainte, as the King's German Legion defenders of the farm, one of Wellington's 3 forward positions at Waterloo, scrambled to douse the flames with camp kettles whilst coming under fire from the French. The third holds an almost mythological status: Hougoumont, the siege within a battle that saw a multinational force of Coldstream and Scots Guards, alongside Hanoverian and Nassau troops, defend the chateau, and yet as they did so, that same chateau famously burned down around them. There are few things more disconcerting than trying to defend a burning building from a few thousand angry Frenchmen, whilst also trying to not die as a result of the flames. But what was it actually like for the defenders of Hougoumont? What were their bodies going through? How did the fire spread? And what could they actually do to try and deal with the literal conflagration around them? Joining me to discuss this is firefighter, British Army veteran, historian, co-host of the Napoleonic Wars pod, and, as I labelled him recently, the Napoleonic Nerd's beefcake, Liam Telfer. Liam, good to see you again. How you doing, mate?
I'm well, mate. I'm well. It's slightly odd being on this side of things, talking about my own stuff, but yeah, I'm really excited, and I hope that the listeners really enjoy it, because it's definitely a bit of a passion project of mine.
Let's start with the fundamentals then. What do we know about where the fire sits in the timeline of the defence of Hougoumont and indeed Waterloo? Let's situate ourselves first of all.
Okay, so just moving away from the fire for a second, the sort of opening phases of the battle, where we see the French first attacking Hougoumont, and we do have to take these timings with a pinch of salt. I think if we'd have checked everyone's watches across the battlefield, they'd all be slightly different, but we're talking somewhere in the relation of sort of 11:30, 12 o'clock, right? That's when the Hougoumont first comes under attack. The idea being that Wellington's right is sort of rolled up and breached, and Napoleon's forces can advance around from their left flank. In terms of the fire itself, then, again, there are sort of numerous sources about the timings. One of my sort of go-to primary sources on this is a chap called Captain Moritz Bösgen. I hope I'm not butchering that translation, that pronunciation too much. And he's a captain within the 2nd Nassau Infantry, and he states that the fire started somewhere between sort of 2-3 o'clock. It's an interesting point for it to start, because it's the battle's already sort of intensifying. It's sort of mid phase, if you will, after the French repeated attacks are failing to break down into Hougoumont.
Okay, so at this point we've had the break-in. So that there are many break-ins which folks will know about if they listen to the show regularly. So we've had the supposed Le Gros break-in. I know there's a whole debate about, does he have an axe, is he even there, and so on and so forth. But certainly the break-in in the North Gates happened. Now there are also going to be break-ins at other points. We've had the first attempt on Wellington's left. That has then been defeated with the countercharge. That's all kind of going on around the time that the fire breaks out. Before we get into the spread and all the rest of it, just remind listeners who is in this part of the complex, particularly the chateau, because again, one of the points that often gets missed, especially when people visit today, is they see what exists today, and that's the limit of what you get to see, because the orchard has gone, the woods have all gone. So in terms of that wider complex, who is, I guess, in the wider region, but also who's in the chateau itself, because not everyone is there trying to find a window to point a musket out of.
No, and it's sort of quite simple to just state, which units are within the confines of Hougoumont itself. But obviously, the nature of the combat at the time, these guys would bleed into one another quite quickly. But just to sort of, as a brief overview, we've got light companies from the 1st Foot Guards. We've got light companies from the 3rd Foot Guards. We've got the 2nd Regiment of Foot Guards then. That cause the right consternation, Coldstream Guards. And these units largely occupy the orchard, garden walls, and the buildings of the chateau complex itself. You're right to bring up the sort of multinational nature of the defence at Hougoumont. We have Nassau infantry. I mean, Captain Maurice Boogson is Nassau himself, positioned in the surrounding woods at various stages. And we also have Hanoverian troops, which I think probably more often than not they're probably the most forgotten, that we've got Hanoverians making up sort of part of that wider defensive network. Within the structures themselves, and this is based on archaeological evidence, we know that men from the Coldstreams and 3rd Guards were found in the buildings, equipment from those guys were found in the buildings. And there are plenty of primary source accounts from various people of the Foot Guards talking about their occupations of the Great Barn and the Chateau rooms throughout the siege.
One of the things that I think will help folks is to take a quick look at the satellite images on Google Maps and just kind of look at where the chateau is sort of situated. Now, obviously, all that remains today is the old chapel. That's fundamentally what's left, and a little bit of sort of some of the walls adjacent to that. But if you're ever there, just look at the raised section of ground, fundamentally. You will notice it. It is very obvious. And it's situated quite kind of centrally in terms of so there's an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard, effectively. The outer sort of section being the formal gardens that will shortly be restored. And there's a debate about quite where the orchard is and all the rest of it. But you're within the inner orchard, certainly as it looks today. We're talking about the raised area. In practical terms, if you're defending this complex, never mind, obviously, like defending a building whilst it's on fire is difficult. We'll get to that. But in terms of trying to defend the inner section itself, how much more difficult does it become from a practical position, for particularly thinking about you and your combat experience? If this thing goes up, how much are you ending up kind of looking behind you versus looking outwards? How much of a distraction is this? Talk us through the complexities that this creates beyond sort of the obvious that it's hot and you need to avoid it if you can.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really interesting to look initially of how the fire started. It wasn't French people running in there with a Zippo lighter, and it can be sort of directly attributed to Napoleon himself, who gave orders to move these howitzers forward. And as a trained artillery officer, everyone likes to talk about Napoleon in that context. He would have been massively aware of the offensive utility of different ammunitions that these have. Like 12-pound solid round shot would cause major structural damage. But with Napoleon choosing to switch to howitzer shells, with both destructive and, most importantly for us today, incendiary properties, it's a real switch in mindset. I often wonder how much he'd looked at what happened at Ligny a couple of days before, because howitzers had set alight, funny enough, another chateau. And it was so intense that it forced part of the Prussian garrison to sort of jump out of windows and all that sort of stuff. And I think that must have been quite fresh in his mind. Now, the howitzer in particular, we're talking about these Obusier de 6 pouces Gribeval, excellent French from me again, 6-inch howitzers basically, and it's firing that sort of common shell, hollowed out shell, filled with gunpowder, with a fuse at a predetermined, cut at a predetermined place in order to explode when you want it to. And so these shells are landing in Hougoumont and in and around Hougoumont, and I think it is the Emperor's intention to partly to not only knock down walls but to burn out the Allies defending it. And yeah, through this, then a haystack catches light, and that fire then spreads to part of the roof. And we're talking about particularly the southern side of Hougoumont here, so where the gardener's house is today, and then it basically spreads from there. Now, thinking of, like you said, about a sort of defensive position, and how practical that is at this point. Now, it won't shock anyone to know that, buildings on fire are untenable firing positions, right? You've got natural materials, wooden beams for floors. They will burn, they will then collapse. So you've got collapsing floors, collapsing ceilings, and roofs. It's a rudimentary construction technique. Not only that, but the intense heat and sort of radiant energy will force defenders to withdraw or relocate. Now, particularly if you're thinking of the southern part of Hougoumont, where the French are coming from, that's where the majority of your muskets are pointing. So it does create an interesting scenario. And I think it's interesting to look at the fire shortly after it sort of taken hold in around the farmyard at Hougoumont. It is one of our favourite Sergeant Edward Cotton, who was with the 7th Queen's Own Light Dragoons. Now, it's difficult to tell exactly where he is, but judging by maps in various sources, particularly in like the Waterloo Companion, Mark Adkins' excellent work, he's got to be at least sort of 800 metres to a kilometre away with the 5th Cavalry Brigade. And he says that the whole of the chateau and a portion of the out offices were on fire. From the right of the Allied position, the appearance was awfully grand. So he can see that, or at least see signs of it. So, there's clearly a lot of smoke and a lot of heat. Now, smoke reduces visibility. We've talked about things like the fog of war on here before. So it's going to complicate communication as well as where you're aiming your musket. I think we haven't even started talking about things like the physical threats of burns, suffocation, heat stress, which I think we'll probably get to a little bit later. But yeah, it really sort of affects your force laydown. Where can I put people? Well, I can't put them in there because it's on fire. And actually, Wellington himself comments on this. He says in a note that's taken to Hougoumont, I see that the fire has communicated from the haystack to the roof of the chateau. You must, however, still keep your men in those parts to which the fire does not reach. And it's quite funny, actually. It's almost contradictory. Take care that no men are lost by the falling in of the roof or floors. And after they have fallen in, occupy ruined walls inside of the garden, particularly if it should be possible for the enemy to pass through the embers in the inside of the house, which is interesting. He's like, don't get anyone hurt. I don't want anyone getting injured, but keep them there as long as we can. And sort of looking at my firefighter experience, at this point, these are going to be areas that are very hot. They're going to be very smoky, and they're not going to be particularly respirable atmospheres. They're going to be irrespirable in that sense. So trying to defend a position with the French in front and fire behind is extremely difficult.
Does it also create a barrier for the French? If it's on fire, just as you can't stand there and take pot shots at anybody trying to sort of come towards it, the French kind of can't come through that conflagration. Does it kind of work in that sense that it's a temporary barrier, if nothing else, so you can pull guys out, find other places for them to sort of try and compensate for the lack of field of fire that you are losing because you can't put men in that sense? Does it kind of help in terms of here's an additional obstacle, or is it actually much more of a disadvantage for the defenders?
I think to start with, it's probably a sort of clear disadvantage for the defenders, right? Because they're on top of it. They're the ones that are going to be suffering most. I think the sort of psychological confusion of the defenders plays into the attackers, into the French hands. There's accounts that say that, there was confusion was great. Many men were burned and stuff like that. Now that is going to affect your will to fight. If the closest crocodile is the building that you're standing in is on fire. I also think from almost like a signposting point of view for the French. You know, they've traversed through this thick wood that we know that was to the south of Hougoumont, and they'd be able to see signs of smoke and flame as they're advancing through. So you're right, it does create a barrier, but I think it's also interesting to look at it from the psychological point of view of the building's on fire. Why haven't they surrendered? Why haven't they evacuated? Why aren't we marching around this? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's a really interesting sort of thought process. I wouldn't want to be in there, but they still are. And they're still giving as good as you know, giving us as good as we can get, as it were. So I think it's sort of interesting in all the ways, to look at it as a sort of barrier to everyone, as it were.
Yeah, that's funny because from the French perspective, I kind of assumed that it would work the other way in the sort of sense of chin up, boys. The place is on fire. They're clearly gonna, you know, they might be sort of standing there defending it, but you know they're distracted. This is going to be an easy one, so it might have heartened the French and kind of emboldened them to think, well, you know, the building's on fire. They're clearly not going to be focused enough, and this therefore gives us the distraction, the diversion that we need to. Therefore, all we need is one more push kind of mentality. But I suppose there's also that kind of difference in terms of how the officers might have tried to spin it versus what you're saying, which is, yes, sir, it is on fire. And they're still there firing upon us. Would you care to sort of comment on that, please? And thank you. I also love the psychology of the Wellington scribbled note. And I got into a debate with Ashley Trueluck, who's a battlefield guy, retired major general, and he and I see this very differently because I see it as Wellington the micromanager, and it is Wellington the micromanager fundamentally. You know, if it barks like a dog and looks like a dog, it is a dog. And in this case, we know Wellington to be the ultra micromanager. We know that he gets very frustrated when his precise thoughts and desires aren't implemented exactly as he wants them on the spot. He is close enough that he can send a rider to state what to Macdonald would have felt like the blindingly flaming obvious, pun absolutely intended on this occasion. You know, you kind of can't help but think that in an age post Conan Doyle, if a letter like that was sent, there were some pretty pithy comments about Sherlock might have been made. Regardless, you know, do make sure that nobody dies as a result of the fight. Now, Ashley spins it the other way, and he suggests that actually this is a case of Wellington showing Macdonald, look, I can see the situation that you're facing by sending this note, kind of giving you guidance on what to do in this situation. I am kind of demonstrating that I have oversight of it, and this is a reassurance to you, and you know this is sort of the best that I can provide. Personally, I don't see it that way. I see this very much as sort of that kind of stance that I imagine serving personnel have all of the time when some senior officer comes in and makes a comment, and you kind of think, yeah, thanks very much, sir. We had that one kind of figured out about 10 minutes before you even realized that this was an issue. And I don't really need you chirping in my ear, telling me things that I already know. Now, with your army experience, I imagine you've seen all kinds of permutations on this. Perhaps not sort of immediately kind of having to respond to, well, I don't know, maybe you have had sort of over zealous captains sort of turning around and sort of telling this corporal of horse that he needs to do X, Y, and Z. Sure, thanks very much, sir. And then some things get muttered under your breath. But what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's, you know, your points on the sort of the psychological boost, as it were, of the fire is interesting because clearly that would, I think I agree with you to a point, you know, and you've got your officer at the front there waving his sword, being like, one more push, chaps, and we're in. But then you're not. And I think the sort of the backlash of that is not only like this guy is going to get us killed. He clearly doesn't know what's going on. So yeah, I think it's we know, and we talk about Ed Costa's work on this show, like, you know, it's almost it's like my own personal Bible, really. But you know, none of these soldiers, and I think I don't want to sort of project it onto the French without the data, but none of these soldiers are there fighting for their officers, for their, you know, for the glory of the empire and all that sort of stuff. They're fighting for each other and they're fighting to stay alive. And when particularly the psychological effects of being, I mean, the note from Wellington, I think, is interesting, like you say, but because that's a kind of like, yeah, cool, thanks very much. And I think that probably comes down very quickly from from officers as well. You know, we're doing our best here. He's just up. He's sat at the helm with his telescope. I think it's interesting to look at it from that French point of view. The fact that the French keep coming when resistance doesn't break, even when effective firing positions within the complex have been taken down. You know, the elevator positions have burnt through. You know, you're not going to have people in the roof of the firing from the roof of the chateau when it's collapsed or when it's on fire. Yeah, I think for both sides, it's the men are going to do what the men are going to do. I know that sounds really vague, but they're going to they're going to stand behind a wall and load and fire, or they're going to keep going until they can't, and at which point their own morality will take over.
In practical terms, in sort of tackling this blaze, which is the other kind of obvious question to ask you, I guess, what can they do about it? You know, what have they got at their disposal? I mentioned right at the top of this, the stories of the KGL in La Haye Sainte desperately grabbing their camp kettles, dousing, sort of sticking them in the pond, and then trying to douse the flames that way, and sort of having these sort of constant chains of men sort of trying to do that, whilst others are sort of dealing with fighting the French attempts to get inside. So we have the testimonial, the very famous testimonial of that. In terms of Hougoumont, there's obviously a well. There are, in fact, I'm told, two wells in the Hougoumont complex, but there is one literally right by the chateau building, the core building. What scope do they actually have to get this under control? Could they feasibly have stopped this? Bearing in mind that you'd say this starts in a haystack, straw being very famously quite flammable material. I can imagine that it wouldn't have taken more than a couple of minutes for that haystack to be all over the place in terms of being alight.
Yeah, the short answer is they couldn't have done anything about it. Let's be honest. Now, I did some really interesting stats as part of this research that is done in conjunction with sort of modeling and sort of practical computing and projection, as it were, from the National Fire Protection Association, which is it's US based, but they're an international non-profit devoted to eliminating death, injury, and property damage due to fire. So they're the sort of the real gurus on this. Now, looking at the building, the type of building, the materials it's constructed from, and this is before we bring in weather, which is another key fact, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about. In order to extinguish a fire of that size, we're going to need 40,000 plus liters of water. Now, if you equate that to a modern fire engine, although an augmented supply, i.e., a hydrant running into a pump, into a fire engine's pump. Now, but for straight up fire engines, that's approximately 30 fire engines worth of water to extinguish this fire once it's taken hold. I must add that it's once it's taken hold, right? Because clearly, if they'd managed to catch it at the haystack, it wouldn't have spread. Or in the early sort of moments of the embers getting into the chateau, but we know that didn't happen. Now it's really interesting that that some of the guards were ordered to carry out firefighting. Major Drummond was ordered to place men in a garret on the top floor in the family quarters to carry out firefighting. But like you say, they're going to be using what they've got to hand. Camp kettles, which is about 12 liters. It's a very small dent in your 40,000 liters right there. And although the primary sources that they were constantly supplied with water and sort of managed to check some of the flames, that is the best possible scenario, that they can perhaps hold some of the compartments and protect some of the compartments. But once it's taken hold, there's nothing they can do. Like you say, they might have buckets. They could have used their cap covers as an improvised device. But thinking of things like the camp kettles and the buckets, the camp kettles, for instance, would have been shared among messes of about six men. So it's not like they've got them in stacks. Their equipment, their uniforms have absolutely no fire protective qualities whatsoever. And the uniforms, particularly if wet from the rain and from mud, or even just sweat, that actually increases the likelihood of you being burnt because the heat will radiate into the water and you'll get steam burns and prior to the point of the wool catching fire once it's sort of reached its thermal capacity. So yeah, like I said, I think efforts would only be able to check rooms and never fully extinguish the fire. I mean, this would be something that's going to be hot for days, let alone hours. And any attempt really to control the fire in the sense of certainly of modern firefighting is completely futile given the sort of scale and the structure involved.
So essentially, at best, they're going to buy a little bit of time and not much more. You mentioned the weather. Now, initially, you would kind of think, well, look, it's rained the previous day, Liam. Therefore, lots of things are going to be wet. Surely that's helpful. Now, let me ask the actual expert. Is that the case?
Well, in theory, yes. In theory, yes. However, it's roofs are on buildings for a reason, right? And the water would sort of it would reduce the thermal capacity of the external materials to a level. However, once that material is dry, then it's it's about as much use as a chocolate fire guard, pardon the pun. And I think more importantly, in the case of Hougoumont, is the wind direction. Yes, we know it was a warm day, so it's going to dry out these structures and the building materials within them quicker. But the wind direction is really important. Now, it's very difficult to put a sort of a finite sort of point onto which direction the wind was going. But obviously, the wind itself will not only push embers and smoke and flames, but will also create what we call flow paths within a building. So if you imagine a two-story building, for example, and there's a window open on the top floor, but it's at, say, the opposite side. If I then open the front door, because the differences of high pressure and low pressure, and the wind is coming from behind me when I open the door, the wind will find its way upstairs, through rooms, and it will exit the building through the vent, as it were, through the outlet. Now, if you're using a building as a firing position, whether you're doing it through open windows or through loopholes you've created, you've basically got a giant Swiss cheese of a building, and whichever direction the wind is coming, it will affect the flow of air through that building. Now, obviously, fire needs air. To give it some sort of specific geographical context for Hougoumont, there are a couple of weather stations within sort of Belgium and the Netherlands that recorded wind direction on that day. Now, these are prevailing wind directions, so there is a bit of a scientific sort of leap, but it's close enough for it to be plausible that the wind was coming from, was blowing a southwesterly, and it was recorded as being a force 3 on the Beaufort scale, which basically means leaves and small twigs that will be in constant motion, and light flags will be extended, and large wavelets on the sea. Not that we're anywhere near the sea at this point. So it's a decent enough breeze. Now, that with that being southwesterly, and we talked about the position of Hougoumont on the map, it's coming from the southwest. So it's coming from behind Napoleon's left and going up towards, in the position of Hougoumont, it's basically cutting across towards Mont Saint-Jean and traveling in that direction, which in itself is really interesting because it's going to show that fire spread more pertinently from south to north, Gardener's House to Chateau, as it were. And it's also going to affect how that smoke travels. So the smoke is then going to travel northeast across the ridge. And it's a bit of a sort of, it's not a leap because the science is there. And it may have dissipated long before it reached sort of Mont Saint-Jean and places like that. But you don't have to squint too hard to think that it could have created a sort of tactical advantage to either mask movements or troop locations on Wellington's right flank because the smoke's blowing across their front. And it could add even greater context to some of the Allied counterattacks to the Imperial Guard assaults on Wellington's right flank because they perhaps were obscured somewhat by smoke from Hougoumont. So in a way, perhaps setting it on fire wasn't the best idea, but I digress slightly there.
So, I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? That from Wellington's perspective, you don't want this place on fire or burning down, but actually, in the grander story of the battle, maybe that assisted the situation substantially. Let's shift focus now. You've knocked on the door of this a little bit, but in terms of the impacts of this fire on the defenders, what's it doing to their bodies? I mean, this sounds like such a dumb question to the uninitiated. Well, it's a fire, Zach. It's going to burn them. But there's much more to this, particularly for these guys. And we'll start with the heat. These guys are under a lot of stress, first of all. They're not going to be particularly well nourished. Sure, maybe they managed to get hydrated over the course of the morning, but the process of fighting in itself is a dehydrating thing. We often kind of don't appreciate the level of physical exertion required to load and fire at speed. So talk us through what happens when you combine that. They are going to be sweating anyway with this massive source of heat. What's it doing to them?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to start the sort of effect of the fire on the troops by looking at their sort of previous 48 hours slightly a little bit. Yeah, so these guys are already dehydrated on the 17th, let alone the 18th. Some of them have been marching and fighting, considering the action at Quatre Bras, for upwards of 42 hours. So your body is already in a state of sort of emergency mode in terms of your calorific intake and your hydration level. Looking at the calorific deficit is really interesting because there are some great accounts of the foot guards marching to Quatre Bras and not having time to eat. Now, we know as a result of the action there that they camped in the Bois de Boisseau, and Clay mentions it wonderfully where he finds a camp kettle to try and get water, but realizes the water source is contaminated, so they don't drink anything then. Now, this is on the 16th. This is 2 days before we're actually talking about here. So not only do they have, they're already dehydrated, they don't have the right amount of calories, they also have very limited water access. They've all got a canteen, but that's only somewhere in the region of 3 pints or 1.7 liters in new money. So it's a vicious circle of what's happening to their bodies. When you add the occasion of firing, now I know I will get to how the fire is going to affect them, but saltpeter is a main component of gunpowder. You're ingesting not huge amounts, but you're ingesting some saltpeter from firing and loading. Every time you reload your musket, you're going to ingest some saltpeter, which is diuretic, which is going to make you need to urinate more, and therefore you're going to need to keep drinking. If you haven't got time, then you are highly likely to be increasingly dehydrated. Now, looking at how this will affect their bodies, look at the heat that they are potentially exposed to, the ambient temperature. It was a hot day, the sources agree on that. Gunpowder ignites somewhere in the region of 500 degrees centigrade, and wood and straw reach their thermal capacity, that ignition point, at somewhere around 220 to 300 degrees centigrade. Now, these are pretty high temperatures. Some of the temperatures that they are facing in the buildings could be upwards of 1,000 degrees. That point of flashover where everything in the room ignites because it's got to a temperature and a level of the fire gases where it will ignite. So standing close to structural objects, beams, rooms, spaces that are on fire are going to raise your core body temperature dramatically. Now, we talked about that radiation through either wet uniforms or sweat. The likely outcomes of this, or the sort of the least worrying outcome of this, is heat exhaustion and heat stroke, symptoms of which include confusion, impaired judgment, dizziness, which is probably not what you want when you're trying to make life saving or life changing tactical decisions, thinking about senior NCO and officers' point of view. And it hugely increases the chances of loss of consciousness, collapse, and even coordination. And we've talked about loading a musket before. All those movements, you're not going to be on your best form. So it's really going to impact the way the soldiers are feeling, the way the soldiers are communicating, and the way in which that the leaders within their units get orders through.
Okay, so that's the heat element of it. What about the smoke?
Okay, well, it's important to look at what smoke is very briefly. So smoke is unburnt fire gases. It's the result of pyrolyzation of an object. Now that will spread in various ways, through gaps, through windows, out of windows, which is just as important, and we'll get to that. But rooms and garrets basically act as chimneys, and that will funnel smoke upwards towards defenders on upper floors. Not only is that smoke irrespirable, in a thick enough environment, you've probably got about 3 or 4 breaths before you lose consciousness, and will die very quickly afterwards due to lack of oxygen, because there's no oxygen, or very low levels of oxygen in there, because the fire's using all the oxygen as part of its processes. Like I said, structural voids and multi-level spaces will create flow paths where these hot gases and smoke can not only travel but congregate. And you've got to think of smoke itself is hot. It will take particulates with it, embers and such. And I think particularly for the buildings on the north end, when we go back and think about the wind direction, they are not only going to be smoke logged quite early on, i.e. there's no fire, but we can't be in here because it's too smoky. I think particularly about the Great Barn on the northern edge of Hougoumont by the North Gate that was used as a point for the wounded. And it's going to push units or soldiers out of areas which, although still intact, they're indefendable in that sense because of the smoke. Obviously, when you start to fill compartments with smoke and heat generation, that can lead to flashover. That smoke can cause cause ignition, as it were. So yeah, it blinds your view, not only from what you're shooting at potentially, but it also obscures what your officers are trying to, if we have got this southwesterly and you're looking for ammunition for resupply and it's traveling up towards the ridge, and you're using communication means of line of sight, you're going to have to recite or send a runner. So it really changes the tactical situation of how do you defend Hougoumont when you can't occupy rooms or see in rooms or indeed see out of rooms.
I mean, the guys must have been suffering from the effects of this for literally days afterwards, even if they survived. Just think, if you go and spend a bit of time around a sort of smoky campfire, for those of you who are prone to sort of sinus flarings, very quickly your entire sort of naval cavity will start to clog up, even in the course of sort of a couple of hours. And that's whilst you're around sort of a nice little campfire, maybe sharing a drink and having a great time. Now take that and multiply it by about 50,000. These guys must have had breathing problems during the battle, even if they weren't directly inhaling sort of a lot of this smoke. So even if they weren't sort of in the line of smoke drift, or however you might term it, what do the soldiers say about dealing with all of this, from the psychological elements to the physical elements? Just talk us through what these guys kind of say on both sides, both the French reactions, but also for the defenders. What do they say about all of this? Because it must feature in accounts. You don't have this building that you're defending just go up around you and go, oh yeah, it got a bit hot, but we just kept on doing our duty. I really don't think that's of things that are going to stay in people's minds. The fire surely has to be one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that comes out very clear in the primary sources. It's almost like the theme within the theme, that almost like that Hougoumont the battle within the battle, the fire's the battle within Hougoumont. And there's some brilliant accounts of how it was either in real time. For instance, Matthew Clay of the Third Foot Guards talks about being posted in an upper room of the chateau and being higher than the surrounding buildings, which gives us a good idea of where he is. Although the disclaimer is that it was written sometime after the fact, so the biases and such. But and he's talking about annoying the enemy skirmishers from a window when the enemy started throwing their shells amongst us and set the building on fire. It's interesting. He makes the comment that our officer placing himself at the entrance of the apartment would not permit anyone to quit his post until our position became hopeless and too perilous to remain, fully expecting the floor to sink with us every moment. And in our escape, several of us were more or less injured, which I think it's sort of contradictory to Wellington's view and plan. And I've often, I could never prove it, but I've often thought, is this officer suffering in some way from some sort of heat-related illness? We are in this room, we will defend it regardless, and like suffering from that lack of judgment and that sort of the slowing down of cognitive process. And there's a load of accounts. I mean, Sergeant Cotton, we've spoken about. A private Johann Peter Leonard, who's another Nassau, talks about the sky turning into an ocean of fire. Now, I know that, again, that there's the bias of time here, but this is something that is indelibly marked on the men that experienced it. There's accounts, some awful sounding accounts from the foot guards of when the barn was set alight, where the horses were being stabled, that the horses rushed out, the officers' horses rushed out and then rushed back into the flames, completely overstimulated by the gunfire, by artillery fire, and by the fire itself. And at times there's another great account of a guy rescuing his brother and asking permission to rescue his brother. I forget his name. It's one of the foot guards who's a corporal. He rescues his brother from within the barn who was wounded. So yeah, it's hugely, like you say, it's tattooed on their souls that the effect of this, and they're being forced to choose between either death by fire or injury by fire and exposure to enemy fire. It's not only going to have the effects that you spoke about, that like asthma and breathing related problems and burns on their lungs and stuff like that. It's going to have a huge psychological impact for the rest of their lives. And one point that I don't really get into in this paper, it's sort of beyond the scope slightly, or 2 points really, is the French reaction to that. It's not something that I've really researched, but I think it's well worth doing. But also the effects of these contaminants in later life. We know now as modern firefighters, we have to change our fire gear regularly, after any exposure to particulates, contaminants that are present within smoke, because smoke's carcinogenic. And I wonder how that impacted soldiers in later life. It's interesting. You've really got to read between the lines in some cases to pick out the psychological impact, because mental health awareness being what it was in 1815, it's very much a stiff upper lip and think of England, as it were, or Scotland, as the case may be, or even as wherever you're from. But there has to have been a pretty major psychological impact on these soldiers for the rest of their lives.
I mean, the ocean of fire kind of comment really sort of speaks to trauma and sort of almost something too big to process. for that particular individual. So that doesn't surprise me in the least. And as you say, we can never know definitively, how many of these guys sort of suffer subsequently, but nonetheless, the chemistry and the biology sort of speak for themselves. This event is going to cause a whole sequence of legacies. The defenders of Hougoumont, the victims of the Hougoumont defense, are going to actually be far higher than the numbers who die on the 18th of June or die of subsequent more obvious wounds. One final question, I guess, kind of looking at this as an opportunity for the French. We talk so much about the Wellington quote that the success of the Battle of Waterloo hung on the closing of the gates of Hougoumont, a comment that we've debated on this show that you could continue to debate quite hotly. For the French, for all that you can make the argument, as Charles Esdale has done, that Hougoumont doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things, a concept that I would contest, if only for the fact that it sucks in such a significant proportion of Ray's corps that it becomes significant purely through that. Those are troops that cannot be redeployed elsewhere. Is there anything that the French could or perhaps should have done to exploit this opportunity? Thinking about this from a very sort of tactical perspective, sure, you can do obvious, these are banal comments to make, but you can keep up the firing to make it even more hard to defend this place. You're trying to fight a fire whilst the shells continue to fall. But more, I suppose, from a tactical perspective, is there more that perhaps should have been done that we can see now through very obvious hindsight that perhaps didn't occur to the attackers at the time?
Yeah, I think it potentially, yes. I think definitely, but the evidence suggests that they didn't really. I think, Ray and his troops, and obviously particularly the young Bonaparte, is so task focused at this point. It's very difficult to see the wood for the trees or the buildings for the smoke, as it were. We've talked about once the structures are on fire, defenders being weakened, being disorientated, being displaced, and the fire turning parts of Hougoumont into choke points and removing that defensive cover. But the French attacks were still piecemeal and still maybe uncoordinated is unfair, but sort of not coordinated enough to exploit the moment that the big buildings became untenable. Now, it's very difficult to predict that from outside, from the southern side of the killing ground, when you have been, being laced with Allied musket balls for, like we said, we're talking about the fire at about 3:00. Some of these guys have been under fire sort of 3-4 hours before the fire starts. Now, then trying to coordinate effectively to assault the North Gate again, perhaps, and cause a breach there, or the sort of the Western Gate, perhaps, or even in the corner of the Formal Garden. I think had the French been more coordinated, and I don't want to say driven in the sense that they were motivated, but kind of just could have stepped back almost and looked at it for what it was, I think the French could have done more. If foot guards have been drawn away from firing positions or from reserve positions to fight the fire, they are therefore not on the end of a brown bess. And Napoleon's intent may all along have been to burn the defenders out, but kind of no decisive infantry exploitation followed that. So, yeah, it's a long-winded way of saying probably had they just have been able to focus, on those choke points better.
And two perfect demonstrations of that are the breaking of the southern gate, which gets blown open by a shell, and then the defenders manage to reseal it because there is an infantry support in close enough proximity to exploit that opportunity and force their way inside. But equally, one of the reasons that we know about the break-in in the west is because of an account whereby a soldier talks about coming out of the burning chateau because he's literally just evacuated it and running headlong into some very disorientated French guys who have just found their way through the Western Gate. So it's interesting that this piecemeal nature is so of the attacks. It is so integral to the story of the failure to get inside Hougoumont, which perhaps kind of speaks to your point that actually by this point in the afternoon, the that whole section of Napoleon's army is a bit of a spent force, and the cohesion, the clear sense of command structure has fundamentally been lost. We could doubtless talk about this for another hour, but we will call a halt there. Folks, you've been listening to Liam Telfer, co-host of the Napoleonic Wars podcast, who has been doing this research for an article that is being turned into part of an edited collection on a series of papers that were delivered at the War and Peace in the Age of Napoleon conference in York a couple of years ago. That collection is being edited by myself and Luke Reynolds. So rest assured, as soon as it becomes publicly available, you will be able to find out all about it, because we won't stop shutting up about it. And we are making sure that it will be free, or at least the current plan is that it will be free for you to access. We will keep you posted on that. Huge thank you once again to Liam. But you know the drill, folks. This has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. Stay nerdy. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? If so, be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us, and leave us a comment if you're on Spotify or YouTube, and you never know, we might feature it in a future episode. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, then sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early November 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mars Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, Simon Weathers, and John C. The Admirals: Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, Kate Walcombe, Simon, David Maxwell, Adam Coslin, JC Kaiser, Brian Silicate, Clemens Beman, and Dan Hazelwood. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Paltry Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, and General Alexander Zuvorov Seth Hansen. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of Liam, Luke, and Louis, and myself, of course, take care of yourself, folks. Stay well, stay nerdy, and as always, thank you for listening.